Franklin Hayes had everything a man could want. At 51, he owned a high-rise apartment overlooking the Chicago River, a collection of art that could rival museums, and a tech empire that the financial world watched like a weather vane. Yet none of these mattered anymore. Not since the accident. It had happened 15 months ago, on a private ski trip to Aspen. His son, Tyler, just 10 at the time, had insisted on trying the slope meant for older kids. Franklin remembered the moment vividly. The bright red of Tyler's jacket against the snow, the sound of laughter that carried downhill like a hymn, and then the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from quiet, but from the sudden absence of life, as it was just seconds before. Tyler had lost control, hit a tree. The spinal injury was immediate and irreversible, the doctors had said. Paraplegia. That single word had more weight than any financial crash, more finality than death itself. It became a sentence Franklin read over and over in his mind, like a curse he couldn't lift. Since then, the penthouse had grown colder despite the state-of-the-art heating. The walls, once adorned with color and sound, seemed to echo only the quiet hum of machines and the soft, labored breathing of a boy who no longer dreamed. Tyler no longer smiled. He no longer spoke unless spoken to, and even then, it was as though his words were filtered through a veil of fog. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of a wheelchair and the 3 windows overlooking the river. He would sit for hours, watching boats drift past like ghosts. Franklin, for all his money and influence, found himself powerless. He had flown in specialists from Zurich, Tokyo, Tel Aviv, each one more highly regarded than the last, and each one equally defeated. They spoke of experimental nerve regeneration, stem cell therapy, robotic exoskeletons. He paid for all of it. Nothing worked. Every time Tyler tried to stand, his legs betrayed him. And every time that happened, a little more of the boy disappeared. Franklin wasn't just grieving his son's injury. He was mourning a version of Tyler that no longer existed. The energetic child who once begged to race him up the stairs, who jumped into bed at midnight to share his dreams, who wrote short stories about dragons and pirates and robots. All gone. And Franklin blamed himself in ways he could never admit aloud. Had he been too busy? Too indulgent? Had he let guilt become his form of parenting? Most days, he would come home late, not from work, but from driving aimlessly. He would watch Tyler through the crack of the bedroom door, unable to step inside, unable to break the stillness that seemed too sacred and too sad to touch. He started drinking in moderation, but even the bourbon tasted empty. It was during one of those long, empty evenings, February's wind scraping against the glass like fingernails, that the knock came. Light, hesitant, but somehow definitive. Franklin opened the door and looked down into the face of a girl who didn't belong in his world. Not in her threadbare jacket, not with the wind curling around her ankles through holes in her shoes. She looked about the same age as Tyler, though her eyes carried something ancient. And without preamble, she said something that would unravel everything Franklin believed about life, healing, and the walls between what is broken and what is still possible. "I know how to help your son walk again." At first, Franklin said nothing. He stared at the girl, trying to locate the logic in what she'd just uttered, to trace the words back to some kind of delusion. She couldn't have been more than 11 or 12. Her hair was the color of copper wiring, untamed and windblown, and her eyes, wide, pale, and strangely unblinking, met his with the kind of steadiness most adults failed to hold. The hallway lights cast a muted glow over her face, revealing a bruise just under her left cheekbone, faded but not forgotten. Franklin's first instinct was suspicion, followed quickly by concern. Where were her parents? What was she doing here, in the middle of a snow-choked Chicago night, standing at the door of a man who had ceased to believe in miracles? He took a step back. "Who sent you?" "No one," she replied simply. Her voice was calm, oddly still. "But I've been waiting. I knew you'd open the door tonight." There was a silence then, awkward but dense with something unspoken. Franklin should have turned her away. He should have called someone, security, social services, anyone. But something in her presence made it impossible. Not pity, not even curiosity. It was more like recognition, as if she had stepped out of a dream he hadn't known he'd been having. He opened the door wider, hesitantly. "Come in. You're freezing." She entered without thanks, without hesitation. Her steps were light, silent. Franklin noticed she wasn't limping, but something about the way she moved suggested she didn't quite belong to the same rhythm as the rest of the world. She walked past the grand piano, the abstract paintings, the cold leather furniture, taking none of it in, as if material things had no weight in her world. "Who are you?" Franklin asked as he followed her into the living room. She stood by the tall windows, staring out at the river below. "My name's Alara," she said softly. "And I'm not here for you." He felt something clench in his stomach. "Tyler's asleep." She nodded. "I know." That answer shouldn't have made sense, but it did. Every instinct in Franklin told him to shield his son, to end this strangeness before it took root. But Alara wasn't threatening. She was dissonant, like a chord played in a different key, unsettling but oddly necessary. "I don't believe in faith healers," he said, crossing his arms. "I'm not a healer," she replied. "I just help people remember things they've forgotten." Franklin didn't know what that meant, but he knew desperation when it scraped across his ribs. It had a certain flavor, guilt mixed with grief, and just a sliver of hope too dangerous to taste. He moved to pour himself a drink, but didn't finish the motion. "You're not old enough to be talking like this." Alara turned to face him, and this time her voice dropped into something quieter, almost intimate. "Your son doesn't need a miracle. He needs a choice. But to offer it to him, you have to let go of yours." Something inside Franklin recoiled. What the hell does that mean? Instead of answering, she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. Then, finally, she said, "Tyler's been waiting too, you know. For someone to understand that being broken isn't always worse than being afraid." Franklin didn't speak. Couldn't. He felt suddenly exposed, as if she had reached inside him and pulled something forward that had long been buried beneath business calls, surgeries, and sleepless nights. How could she know any of this? "Let me see him," she said gently. Just for a moment. He hesitated. There was no rational justification. Every protective instinct screamed against it. But rationality had long since abandoned him. It hadn't been rational to take Tyler skiing. It hadn't been rational to believe doctors with million-dollar treatments and perfect resumes. It wasn't rational to still whisper apologies to his son through a locked bedroom door. He led her down the hallway. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional hum of the HVAC and the soft tick of a clock that hadn't been wound in weeks. Franklin opened the door slowly. Tyler lay on his side, eyes half open, lost in some waking dream. His small hands were curled against the edge of the blanket, his legs motionless beneath it. Alara didn't move closer. She stood at the threshold, watching. Then she closed her eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Franklin waited for some gesture, some magical incantation, some sign that this strange child wasn't simply lost or mad. But none came. She simply stood there in stillness, as if she was listening to something beneath the silence. And then Tyler stirred. Just a twitch. Barely perceptible. But Franklin saw it. The fingers of his left hand opened and closed slowly, as if sensing the shift in the air. Tyler's lips moved, a breath catching at the edge of his voice. La. "Are," he whispered. Franklin froze. Alara opened her eyes, but there was no triumph in them. Only sorrow. Only the aching weight of someone who knew the cost of what came next. "Let him decide," she whispered. "But remember, every gift has its price." And with that, she turned and walked out the door, vanishing into the night as quietly as she had come. Franklin remained there in the half-dark, staring at his son, who was now wide awake and looking at the door with something like wonder. Or memory. He didn't know who she was. But deep in his bones, he understood this much. She had not come to save Tyler. She had come to ask him what he wanted to be saved from. The morning after Alara disappeared, Franklin found himself sitting beside Tyler's bed without realizing how he got there. The boy was awake, fully awake, not in the usual dull-eyed half-consciousness that had plagued him for months. His gaze was clear but distant, focused not on the room but on something that seemed to hover just beyond it. When Franklin touched his hand, Tyler didn't flinch. He simply looked at him, and in that look, there was no accusation, only quiet knowledge, as if Tyler had always known this day would come. Neither of them spoke about the night before. Alara's name hung unspoken between them like a phantom, too real to dismiss, but too strange to bring into daylight. Franklin wanted to question it, to apply logic to the impossible, but logic had become an exile in this new world. There was only the boy's fragile body, the silence between them, and the growing awareness that something had shifted, not in a miraculous sense, but in something deeper, darker, older. Later that day, Tyler did something he hadn't done in weeks. He asked to go outside. Franklin stared at him. Outside where? Tyler only said, where she came from. It was absurd. But again, he did not say no, because absurdity had already become the new normal. So Franklin called the clinic, canceled his remaining appointments, and packed a small bag without knowing what he was packing for. When the concierge downstairs offered to call them a car, Tyler shook his head. We have to walk. At first. The streets were brittle with wind. Snow still lingered in gutters, clinging to branches, but there was a strange warmth in the air, like the slow exhale before spring. Tyler moved with effort, but with intention. He didn't ask to be carried. He didn't complain. He followed some invisible path, crossing streets and alleyways like a pilgrim retracing the steps of an ancient story. Franklin followed, always a step behind, his instincts fraying at the edges. By mid-afternoon, they reached the edge of the city. The buildings gave way to industrial lots, and then to the outskirts, empty fields laced with rusted fences and abandoned billboards. They walked along a stretch of cracked highway until a car appeared in the distance, an old silver sedan with no license plate, idling just off the shoulder. The driver was a woman in her 50s with eyes like Alara's, gray, unblinking, and impossibly calm. She didn't ask for a name, didn't seem surprised to see them. She simply opened the back door and waited. Tyler slid in. Franklin hesitated, his mind shouting back its last defenses. But then Tyler turned to him and said quietly, "She said you have to come too. Otherwise, it won't work."
So he got in.
The ride was long. Hours passed, maybe more. Franklin lost track of time, lulled by the rhythm of the road and the growing sense that they were moving not just across distance, but away from the world itself. Outside the window, the scenery changed. Cities fell away, then suburbs, then the last traces of the ordinary. The roads narrowed, turned to gravel. Forests rose around them, thick and soundless. Finally, as twilight bled into night, the car stopped. They were at the edge of a clearing. At its center stood an old wooden structure, part chapel, part house, part ruin. The architecture didn't belong to any era Franklin could place. It felt like something pulled from a half-remembered myth. Lanterns flickered at its corners, casting soft halos into the dusk. The woman in the car said nothing, only gestured for them to go on. Inside, the air was warm, perfumed with cedar and something else, something that smelled like rain on old stone. The interior was simple. Cushions on the floor, a low table, a wall covered in hand-drawn constellations. No doctors. No machines. Just presence. And then, Alara appeared. She wasn't alone. A small circle of others stood behind her, children and elders, men and women. None of them speaking, but all somehow part of the same silent design. Alara walked forward and knelt before Tyler. Her expression was different now, not otherworldly, not cryptic, but human. Tired. Tender. "You're ready?" she asked. Tyler nodded. Franklin wanted to intervene. He didn't know what was about to happen, but every fatherly instinct screamed to ask for explanations, safety, assurance. But something stronger stopped him, the realization that this wasn't about him. It never had been. His role, for once, was not to fix or control or protect. His role was to witness. Alara extended her hand, and Tyler took it. Together, they stepped into a small adjoining room, one that pulsed with a kind of impossible stillness. Before the door closed, Tyler looked back at Franklin, his eyes not fearful, but full of that same calm Alara carried. Then the door shut. Franklin waited. He didn't know how long. Hours, maybe. The others brought him tea, bread, and a blanket. They didn't speak. Time stretched and folded into itself. At some point, he dozed, waking with a start to the sound of soft footsteps. Tyler stood in the doorway. He was upright. Not just awake, not just aware, but whole in a way Franklin hadn't seen since before the accident. There was stillness in his limbs, yes, but not the frozen stillness of trauma. This was different. This was the stillness of a boy who had walked through something unspeakable and come back not untouched, but transformed. He smiled, and for the first time, Franklin saw no trace of pain behind it. "What did she do?" he whispered. Tyler walked to him and took his hand. "She didn't heal me," he said softly. "She reminded me how to carry it." Franklin didn't cry. Not yet. He only held his son, aware that whatever happened next would not be a return to the past, but the beginning of something else entirely. And in the quiet that followed, in that sacred threshold between endings and beginnings, Franklin finally began to believe, not in miracles, but in meaning. The days that followed did not unfold like a fairy tale, and Franklin had not expected them to. There was no triumphant return to the city, no parade of doctors announcing Tyler's recovery, no cameras or headlines or curious eyes. In fact, the world outside the forest seemed to forget them entirely, as if, by stepping across the threshold into that strange place, they had temporarily ceased to exist in the world they once knew. And yet, in the quiet hours that stretched between dawn and dusk, something extraordinary was happening. Tyler was changing. At first it was subtle. He spoke more, not in bursts, but with calm intent, asking questions, naming memories Franklin thought were lost. He asked for books, food with flavor, walks beneath the bare-limbed trees. Then came sleep, deep, uninterrupted sleep, the kind that repairs things unseen. And the nightmares that had once clawed through his nights were gone. Not silenced, but released, like birds that had finally found an open window. Franklin watched, and he tried to believe it. But disbelief had been his armor for so long, it clung to him like a second skin. Every small joy was met with a whisper of fear. How long will this last? What's the price? Healing, he had learned, always came with a cost. Sometimes it took your time. Sometimes your faith. Sometimes your memory. And sometimes it came for something you loved. He kept expecting Alara to reappear, to explain what had happened behind that closed door. But she didn't. Not at first. The others came and went, wordless as ghosts, bringing herbs, warm broth, firewood. They treated Franklin with gentle distance, as if he were a guest in mourning. And perhaps he was. Not for Tyler, but for the man he had once been, the one who believed everything could be saved by effort alone. On the fourth evening, as the sky turned violet, Alara came. She entered the room where Franklin sat reading by lamplight, and he looked up with that same sharp longing he'd carried since the night she appeared in his apartment. Not romantic. Not grateful. Just raw. Needing answers. But she didn't sit. Instead, she stood by the door and said, "You should ask what it is you fear most." He was too tired for riddles. "I'm afraid it won't last. That I'll wake up one day, and he'll be gone again. Or worse, he'll be here, but hollow." Alara's face softened. "That's not your deepest fear." Franklin stood, his voice rising against his will. "Then tell me. You were the one who did this. You brought us here. You touched him. You changed something." "No," she said quietly. "I returned him to himself. He did the rest. The healing wasn't in my hands. It never was." He looked at her, searching for deception and finding none. She meant it, and that terrified him more. "Then what did I give up?" he asked. "Because I know something was taken. I can feel it." She stepped forward, her voice no longer gentle. "What you gave up, Franklin, was the story you were clinging to, the one where you failed him, the one where you had to suffer to prove you loved him, the one where guilt was your only truth. You handed that story over the moment you followed him here. And now you don't know who you are without it. Franklin felt something break inside, not like glass, but like ice, slowly cracking under the weight of spring. He sat back down quietly. So what now? He asked. You learn to live with grace, Ilara said. Not gratitude. Not obligation. Just grace. That night, Franklin slept without dreams. He awoke to the sound of Tyler laughing outside, laughing freely, like a boy not haunted by the past. Franklin went to him. They walked together by the stream that wound through the forest, neither of them speaking. They didn't need to. And though the miracle had happened, real and irrevocable, it did not announce itself with trumpets or choirs. It lived in the ordinary, in the way Tyler lifted his face to the sun, in the way Franklin stopped bracing for loss, in the quiet knowledge that something sacred had been returned, not in exchange for a price, but in surrender of control. The miracle was not that Tyler was healed. The miracle was that Franklin, too, was no longer broken. Leia appeared the way silence sometimes enters a room, so quietly that you don't notice until everything feels different. Franklin had seen her before, among the small circle who moved around the healing house with reverent purpose. She never spoke, never stayed long in one place. But there was something in her presence, a kind of restraint that didn't come from shyness, but from grief carefully folded in on itself. Her eyes, deep and ancient despite her youth, lingered on Tyler the way one watches a flame, not with fear, but with the trembling awe of someone who has seen it extinguished once before. It was on the 7th day, just after dusk, that she came to sit beside Franklin by the fire outside. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't offer a greeting. They sat in a silence that wasn't empty. The logs crackled, shedding amber light across her face, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, like it belonged more to the earth than to the air. He reminds me of my brother. Franklin turned slightly, caught off guard by her voice more than her words. She was staring straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap, untouched by the fire's warmth. Your brother? He asked, unsure whether he was meant to respond at all. She nodded slowly. He died. Years ago. We were in the car together. I survived. Franklin said nothing. He knew better than to rush into someone else's pain with sympathy. It was too often a disguise for avoidance. So, he waited. He was 12, Leia continued. Just a kid. We were on our way to visit our grandparents. I was driving. There was black ice and her voice stopped, not as if choked, but as if the sentence had reached a place it couldn't pass. Everyone told me it wasn't my fault, that these things happen. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't hear the sound his head made when she inhaled. I stopped being a person that day. I became a moment that never ended. Franklin felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. The truth of them. The quiet violence of surviving. I came here because I thought maybe if I could help someone else heal, it would mean I deserved to live. She turned to look at him, her expression naked with shame and something more complex. Hope, maybe, but wounded. But the truth is, I couldn't even help myself. For a long time, I wanted someone to punish me. Or forgive me. Either would have been a kind of mercy. The fire popped, a sudden spark leaping between them. Franklin's voice was soft when he spoke. Did you find what you were looking for here? Leia smiled, but it wasn't a smile of peace. It was the fragile kind people wear when they are still trying to believe something. No, she said. But I stopped looking for punishment. That's something. They sat for a while, watching the flames eat through the last of the wood. Eventually, Leia stood. She didn't excuse herself, just placed a small item beside Franklin before disappearing back into the dark, a photograph, faded at the edges, of a boy with laughing eyes and a crooked tooth. Franklin held the photo with care, as if it could bruise. He understood, then, what this place really was. Not a sanctuary, not a miracle factory, but a space where pain could be seen and named without being devoured by it. A place where stories, no matter how broken, could be laid down, not to be erased, but to be carried differently. Tyler came to find him not long after. Who was that? He asked. "A friend," Franklin replied. "Someone who's still finding her way." Tyler nodded, as if he understood. And perhaps he did. Children have a strange fluency for unspoken truths, the kind adults bury beneath language. They walked back to the house together, and as they crossed the threshold, Franklin looked once more toward the fire, half expecting to see Leia still sitting there. But she was gone. Her story remained, though not as weight, but as witness. A thread added to the quiet tapestry being woven in that place. In some ways, Franklin realized the most powerful healers were not the ones who knew how to cure, but the ones who had survived and chose to stay. The changes came slowly, like mist lifting from a lake at dawn, so subtle at first that Franklin questioned if they were real or simply wishful projections of a desperate father. But the truth revealed itself not in grand moments, but in small, almost imperceptible shifts. Tyler began sleeping through the night. Not always, not soundly, but without the sharp cries that used to wrench Franklin from restless dreams. There were mornings when the boy would wake and stare quietly at the ceiling, as if listening to some voice the world couldn't hear, and then turn to his father. Not with warmth, but with awareness. And in that awareness was possibility. Franklin, for his part, began to shed the armor he hadn't realized he was wearing. The shame of not being able to protect his son. The self-hatred that had calcified around every missed sign, every silent scream. For months, years, even. He had carried Tyler like a ghost tethered to his ankle, dragging him through life while pretending he wasn't drowning. But here, in this strange haven with its quiet rituals and broken souls, Franklin found himself able to breathe. The boy he had thought lost was not gone. Changed, yes, scarred in ways no one could fully map, but not unreachable. There was a day, an ordinary one by all accounts, pale sunlight slicing through the windows, the scent of boiling herbs drifting in from the kitchen, when Tyler reached out and touched Franklin's hand. Just that. No words. No eye contact. Just the soft, deliberate contact of a small hand against his, like a truce being offered after a long war. Franklin didn't move, afraid that even breathing might startle the moment away. Something cracked open inside him then, not pain, but release. A grief too long held alone, finally shared without needing to be spoken. He began to understand that healing didn't look like going back. It wasn't a return to the boy Tyler had been, or the father Franklin used to be. It was learning to love what remained, learning to sit beside the silence without needing to fill it. Tyler would never be the same, and neither would he. But perhaps that was the point. Leia, who remained a quiet constant in their days, once told Franklin that healing is not a ladder but a spiral. "You don't ascend," she said. "You circle around the same pain, again and again, but from higher ground." It was only now that he understood her. Tyler still had moments of withdrawal, of blankness, of stillness that felt too much like absence. But there were also moments when he laughed. It wasn't often and it wasn't loud, but it was real. And each time, it struck Franklin like sunlight piercing through a storm. Franklin himself had stopped trying to be strong in the way the world defined it. He let himself cry, sometimes with Tyler in his arms, sometimes alone in the garden. He began journaling again, something he hadn't done since his wife's death. His entries weren't polished thoughts but raw fragments, words like guilt, mercy, still here. He stopped demanding closure and began collecting presents. The difference was quiet, but it changed everything. One afternoon, as they sat beneath a weathered oak tree near the edge of the sanctuary grounds, Tyler suddenly spoke. It wasn't a full sentence, just a word. "Blue." He pointed at the sky. Franklin froze, heart lurching. "Yes," he said, voice trembling. "It's blue." Tyler looked at him, then really looked. The eye contact didn't last, but it was enough to make Franklin's vision blur. Later, when he told Leia about it, she smiled without surprise. "He's been coming back to you," she said, "for a while now. You just learned how to see it." Franklin didn't know if Tyler would ever speak like other children, or live without shadows clinging to his light. But he no longer needed certainty to find peace. Love, he realized, wasn't the act of rescuing someone from their darkness. It was choosing to walk with them through it. And in that walk, both of them were changing. Not back. Forward. Together. It was only after they left that Franklin realized he had never asked Leia where she was going. The departure from the sanctuary had been quiet. No grand farewells. No ceremonies. Just a morning of packing what little they had, folding linens with practiced care, brushing dust from worn shoes. Tyler stood beside him, calmer now, more rooted in his body, though still a boy wrapped in layers of silence. The others offered nods and brief embraces. No one clung, because everyone knew healing was not a place you stayed in forever. It was a threshold. He had looked for Leia that morning, but she was gone. Her room stood empty, bed made with hospital corners, windows flung open to let in the early light. On her pillow sat a folded piece of paper, and Franklin had picked it up with trembling hands, the way someone might handle an old wound reopened. It wasn't long. Just a few lines, written in small, neat script. Some stories aren't meant to end in the same place. Thank you for listening. For seeing me. If you ever need to find me, follow the river. L. For weeks afterward, Franklin tried to forget. Not her, never her, but the need to find her. He told himself that what she gave him was enough. That sometimes people cross into your life like shooting stars, meant to burn bright and brief and beautiful, not to stay. But that was a lie he didn't believe, not even when he repeated it aloud. He thought of her often, especially in the moments between, when Tyler slept, when the air grew heavy with rain, when the world slowed and there was space enough for memory to creep in. He remembered her stillness, her voice like dusk, the way she had never rushed to speak but always said something worth remembering. Tyler asked once, "Where's the lady?" Franklin had blinked in surprise. "Which one?" "The sad one," Tyler said, and then, quieter, with the quiet eyes. He didn't answer then. But he knew. It was spring when he finally gave in to the ache. Tyler was stronger now, still quiet, still fragile in certain ways, but curious, engaged, alive. Franklin had started writing again. Not just in fragments, but full pages, full thoughts. He published a small essay under a pseudonym about grief and silence and fathers who carry the unspoken weight of love like armor. It had been read more widely than he expected, but something remained unfinished. Not a sentence, not even a chapter, something deeper. And so, one morning, he and Tyler packed a bag. No destination. Just a river on a map, and a trail that meandered like memory through small towns and thick woods. They found her outside a weathered cottage, half hidden by vines and the sound of running water. Leia was bent over a small garden bed, hands in the soil, her dark hair falling forward like a curtain. She didn't look up right away, even when they approached. It wasn't until Tyler whispered, "It's her," that she turned. There was no surprise on her face, only a recognition, so deep it felt like an embrace. "You found the river," she said softly. Franklin nodded. "And you?" Leia straightened slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans. Her eyes moved from Franklin to Tyler and back again. There were lines around her eyes now, a deeper stillness in her presence, but also a softness that hadn't been there before. Less guarded, less afraid. "I didn't think you would," she added. "I told myself I wouldn't," Franklin admitted. "But some people stay with you, even when they're gone." They sat outside her cottage, drinking tea that tasted like rosemary and citrus. Tyler explored the edge of the stream, throwing stones, humming a tune only he seemed to know. The quiet between them was familiar, but no longer heavy. They talked, not about the past, not at first, but about now. About the garden she was growing. The children who came to her sometimes, not for therapy but for stories. Leia had become a kind of keeper of lost things, offering space, not solutions. She never claimed to heal anyone. She only witnessed. Franklin told her about the essay, about Tyler's first sentence, about the nights that no longer ended in screaming. Leia smiled. "You're walking the spiral," she said. He laughed, and it caught him off guard. How natural it felt. "I think we all are." That night, After Tyler had fallen asleep on a blanket near the fire, Franklin and Leia sat beside each other beneath a sky littered with stars. There were no declarations, no promises, just the presence of two people who had known darkness and chosen, again and again, to keep walking toward the light. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything.